Why was she walking in silence when every soldier around her had something to say? The boots struck dirt in rhythm, the march pulling dust into the air like a low, reluctant fog. Radios hissed faintly. A cough here, a muttered curse there. Every man in the column tried to kill the weight on his shoulders with words, small jokes, quick breaths, anything to make the miles shorter. But not her. She said nothing. And yet, strangely, it was that very silence that steadied every step behind her. Some of them noticed it only in fragments. A young private at the back would lift his head, see her moving ahead tall, even under the pack, her rifle balanced across her chest, and something in her stillness anchored him. A sergeant caught himself timing his breath with the rhythm of her stride. No orders, no glances, just presence. She didn't look back, she never did. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her silence wasn't discipline. It wasn't strategy. It was survival. Because if she opened her mouth now, if she let one word slip, she wasn't sure she'd be able to keep the dam from breaking. The desert around them stretched in endless pale layers, heat shimmering like invisible fire above the sand. Ahead, the village rose like an afterthought, clay walls slouched against the horizon, thin minarets puncturing the sky. Somewhere inside those walls, their mission waited. A hostage, a clock already ticking, and an enemy they couldn't see. But her mind wasn't in the village yet. It was behind her, thousands of miles away. A kitchen window with yellow curtains, a laugh she hadn't heard in 2 years, and a promise she'd made the night before deployment, whispered into the hair of a boy too young to understand why his mother's hands were shaking. She had promised him she would come back. That was why she couldn't speak now, because if she did, that promise might come spilling out, and promises on the battlefield had a way of turning into ghosts. The squad leader broke the silence first. 5 minutes out, he said over his shoulder, voice clipped low, eyes up. The chatter thinned. Even the nervous jokes dried up. Rifles lifted a little higher. Boots pressed into the dirt with sharper intent. Still, she said nothing. But her silence spoke for her. It was steadier than any command. It told them, I will not falter. You won't either. One of the younger soldiers, Collins, barely 21, freckles burned red by the sun, glanced at her again. He'd only met her a week ago, when the unit merged for this operation. She hadn't said more than a handful of words to him, but in her quiet, he felt something his father used to give him when he was a boy, the assurance that storms could be weathered simply by standing in them. He didn't know that she had once been the storm. He didn't know about the other mission, the one the reports never named, the one she carried like a stone in her chest. She adjusted the strap of her pack, felt the burn on her shoulder, and for the briefest second her hand trembled. Nobody saw, or if they did, they looked away. The column reached the ridge just outside the village. The wind shifted hot, dry, carrying the faint metallic tang of oil fires smoldering somewhere unseen. She crouched, her eyes narrowing through the scope of her rifle, scanning the windows, the rooftops, the broken alleyways. Nothing moved. Too quiet. And that was the problem. The lieutenant motioned them forward. Alpha team left flank, Bravo with me, keep it clean. She fell into position without a word. Her breath slowed, every sense sharpened. The silence that steadied the men during the march now stretched inside her own head like a shield. But beneath that shield, her pulse beat against the past. She remembered the face of another man, her commanding officer from years before, whispering into her comms during a night raid gone wrong. We don't have time. We go now. She had obeyed, and when the dust cleared, when the gunfire stopped, when the screaming faded into a single unbearable note of silence, 3 of them were gone. And she was still here. That night silence had crushed her. Now silence carried her. Her boot touched the first shadow of the village wall. Her hand signaled the team forward. She still hadn't spoken. They moved like ghosts. She took point at the narrow alley. A cracked door swayed in the wind, hinges groaning like a warning. Somewhere inside, a dog barked once and went silent. Her finger brushed the trigger guard, but she didn't raise the rifle yet. Not until she was sure. Her breathing slowed. The air smelled of dust, rust, and something faintly sour, the scent of a place abandoned too quickly. Colin stepped behind her. She could hear his breath quicken, uneven. She remembered that sound from her own first patrol, years ago, the weight of anticipation pressing on ribs like a hand. She turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see her eyes beneath the shadow of her helmet. Calm, unwavering. He steadied. She didn't need to speak. The column pushed deeper into the village. Shadows stretched long and thin. Windows stared down like hollow eyes. She swept her rifle across each corner, each doorway, each stairwell leading into darkness. Still nothing. And yet she felt it, that subtle tightening in her chest, the instinct soldiers don't speak of but never ignore. Something was here. She raised a hand, halting the squad. The lieutenant opened his mouth to ask why, then stopped. He'd learned enough already. If she froze, they froze. Seconds stretched, the air thickened. Then faint, a metallic click. Not a footstep, not a voice. A trigger being pulled back. She spun, shoved Collins to the ground, and dropped into cover just as the crack split the silence. The bullet shattered a wall inches from where his head had been. Chaos erupted, shouts, return fire, dust exploding from clay walls. The village awoke in fury. She didn't shout orders. She didn't need to. Her silence cut through the noise. She moved like the anchor of a storm, each soldier adjusting, firing, covering, because they could read her steadiness even when the world broke apart around them. Her rifle barked once. A figure fell from a rooftop, crumpling into the alley below. Collins looked at her, eyes wide, chest heaving. She met his gaze for a brief moment. There was no triumph in her expression, no adrenaline-fueled grin, only quiet resolve. Because she knew this was just the beginning. The real danger wasn't the first shot. It was what waited deeper inside the labyrinth of walls, where shadows swallowed even the bravest voices. And somewhere in that darkness was the reason she had taken this mission, the reason she hadn't said a word all morning. Something she hadn't told them. Not yet. What did she see in the alley that made her stop breathing for half a second? Gunfire echoed off the walls like rolling thunder trapped in a canyon. Dust poured into the air, thick, choking, stinging eyes. The men shouted to one another, voices fractured by panic, but she kept low, scanning, searching. Her rifle swept across windows, shadows, rooftops. Then she saw it. Not the shooter, not yet, something else. A thin wire, glinting faintly in the sun where it crossed the alley ahead, barely visible, fragile, almost delicate, but her stomach dropped the instant she spotted it. Stop! The word ripped out of her throat before she realized it. One word, the first since the march. The squad froze. Collins fell silent mid-breath. Even the lieutenant, halfway through shouting an order, cut himself off. Her finger pointed sharp, urgent. The wire stretched across the narrow passage, disappearing into the rubble of a doorway. A trap. She tasted iron on her tongue, whether from dust or from the memory it clawed back. She couldn't tell. Years ago it had been a different alley, different city, same wire. She hadn't seen it in time. She'd been too fast, too eager, trusting the map more than her gut. When the blast came, it ripped 3 men apart in front of her eyes. Men she'd trained with, laughed with, promised beers with after the tour. She had survived, they had not. Now staring at the same cruel thread stretched across the dirt, her chest tightened. But this time she had seen it first. The lieutenant exhaled, nodding once. "Good eye," he muttered, his voice a notch softer than usual. Then he waved the squad back, motioning for the demolitions man to crawl forward. She stayed crouched, her rifle steady, eyes scanning above while the soldier disarmed the device below. Sweat dripped from his helmet, splattering onto the dirt. His hands shook more than he wanted to admit. She remembered the first time she tried to steady hands like that. She remembered failing. The bomb went off anyway. Her silence wasn't just habit, it was shield. Every word carried weight, every breath carried ghosts. Finally, a click. The wire sagged, harmless. The demolitions man sagged too, muttering something that sounded like a prayer. "Clear," he said, voice cracking. The squad moved again, but slower, more careful. Their chatter was gone. The silence she carried had spread, filling each of them now. They pushed deeper into the village. The sound of their boots echoed off stone, bouncing down empty streets that smelled of sand and smoke. Somewhere, a radio crackled faintly in the distance, not theirs. Enemy chatter, close. She scanned rooftops again, eyes narrowing at every shadow. Collins edged closer behind her, whispering low so only she could hear. "How'd you see it?" She didn't answer. He waited, then added, almost apologetic, I wouldn't have, not in time." Her eyes flicked back once, just enough for him to see the truth written there. "Neither would I, not the first time." But she said nothing. They turned a corner, another alley, another silence, and then the sound that froze her blood. A child crying. Soft, muffled, echoing from inside a collapsed building to their right. The lieutenant raised his fist, signaling halt. His eyes met hers, a silent question. She crouched low, tilting her head toward the sound. It wasn't a trap, at least not the kind that ran on wires and triggers, but in war children had been used before. Lures, distractions, even weapons. Still, the cry wasn't fake. She knew the difference. It had a break in it, a ragged hitch, the sound of someone who didn't understand fear but felt it anyway. She couldn't ignore it. Against protocol, against the ticking clock of their mission, she moved. Crawling low, rifle ready, heart tightening with each step toward the broken doorway. Inside, the air was cooler, thick with dust motes drifting like ghosts. The sobbing grew clearer. She found the boy under a collapsed beam, his leg pinned by stone. No older than her son when she'd left him. His cheeks streaked with tears and dust. His lips trembling around a language she didn't speak, but the meaning was universal. Pain, fear, desperation. She lowered her rifle, setting it aside just long enough to press her hands to the stone. She pushed. It didn't budge. The boy whimpered louder. She pressed harder, her muscles screamed. The beam shifted an inch, no more, not enough. Collins appeared at her side without hesitation, throwing his weight in. The stone groaned, scraped, then lifted just enough. The boy slipped free, scrambling into her arms. For a moment, just a moment, her chest cracked open. The smell of his hair, the weight of his small frame, the trembling of his thin arms around her neck. It was too much like home. She swallowed hard, forcing the flood back behind her teeth. The lieutenant's voice barked from outside. "We need to move, now." She nodded once, handing the boy off to Collins. They would find a safe corner, leave him in the care of the rear team sweeping in. It wasn't perfect, but it was all they could do. As she slung her rifle back into place, her eyes lingered on the child's face. For the briefest second, she saw her son staring back. And then it was gone. She stepped back into the street. The silence felt heavier now, not steady but fragile. The squad pressed deeper. Every corner now felt sharper, every window more accusing. She forced her breathing into rhythm again, made her silence into a wall the others could lean against. But inside, cracks spread. The lieutenant glanced back once, catching her expression before she masked it again. His brow furrowed. He didn't ask, not yet. Another street, another rooftop, another shadow. Then came the voice. Low, cold, crackling through a radio one of the men carried. "You shouldn't have come here." The squad froze. The words weren't English, but she understood them anyway. She always did. Her chest tightened. Because she knew that voice. Years ago, in a different war, in a different city, That same voice had spoken through smoke and chaos. She had chased it across nights and alleys. She had sworn it was gone. But it was here. She raised her rifle slowly, her silence now trembling at the edges. The men behind her didn't know why she was shaking, didn't know what ghost had just stepped out of the shadows. And she couldn't tell them. Not yet. Why did her hands tremble when she heard that voice? The squad didn't notice at first. To them, it was just another threat, another enemy taunting through stolen radio channels. A scare tactic, common, forgettable. But she knew better. That voice had a weight to it, a cadence, a coldness that clung to the edges of memory like smoke after fire. Her eyes darted to the lieutenant. He was barking orders, shifting men into cover, demanding intel from their overwatch. No one else caught the crack in her silence. She forced her rifle steady, locking her jaw so tight she thought her teeth might break. Not here, not now. She swallowed hard. Control yourself. The mission comes first. The squad pushed on, weaving through alleys and stairwells, the air charged with tension. Every shadow could hide a muzzle. Every doorway could lead to fire. The silence between shots was worse than the gunfire itself. It carried possibility, dread, the weight of what wasn't seen. Still, her ears rang with that voice. You shouldn't have come here. He had said almost the same words years ago. Different language, different battlefield, but the same man. Back then she had chased him for weeks. Through ruined blocks, through bombed-out apartments, through whispers from villagers too afraid to name him. He was clever, slippery, cruel. And on the night she thought she finally had him cornered, he had slipped through, leaving behind only wreckage. Wreckage that still lived in her bones. She had buried that failure, buried it deep under layers of silence and discipline, but now it was clawing its way back. Collins fell into step beside her again, his voice barely above a whisper. What did he say? She didn't answer, she couldn't. The lieutenant cut in before Collins pressed further. Focus, they're trying to rattle us, stay sharp. The team tightened formation, eyes sweeping. Boots scraped over broken stone. Their breaths grew louder than the wind. And then a burst of fire. Rounds snapped past, cracking against walls, sending sparks into the air. The squad dove into cover. Shouts overlapped. Return fire thundered back. Dust filled the lungs, clinging to the back of throats like chalk. She didn't flinch. Her rifle snapped up, her body remembering its role before her mind could catch up. She sighted the flash of a muzzle in a second-story window, squeezed, the figure dropped, the alley momentarily silent again. But her heart didn't slow, because silence never lasted. The lieutenant pressed against a wall, checking his map. His jaw clenched. We're off the planned route, too many choke points, too many ambush sites. We cut through here. He pointed down a narrow lane littered with debris and swung toward the target building. Eyes flicked to her. He didn't ask out loud, but he wanted confirmation. She studied the lane. Windows stacked above, broken shutters hanging like broken teeth. Blind corners, perfect for another trap. Her gut twisted. No, she said quietly. The squad stilled. It was the second word she'd spoken all mission. The lieutenant raised an eyebrow. No. She met his gaze steady. They want us to take it, too clean, too obvious. The men exchanged glances. Doubt prickled in the air. Finally, the lieutenant nodded, curt. He trusted her silence enough to trust her words when they came. They rerouted, slipping instead through a cluster of collapsed homes. The path was slower, more brutal. They crawled over jagged beams, waded through dust thick enough to choke. One man sliced his hand on a shard of rebar, biting back a curse as blood smeared his rifle grip. But they lived. When they reached the far end, a thunderous blast ripped through the alley they had almost taken. Fire curled into the sky. Shrapnel rained down like metal rain. Collins' eyes went wide. His throat worked like he wanted to speak but couldn't. She kept moving, silent, but inside her chest burned, because she knew who had set that trap. And she knew he was watching. They pressed on. The hostage site loomed closer, a crumbling school turned fortress, its courtyard lined with overturned cars and sandbags. The kind of place meant to hold out, to bleed attackers dry. The lieutenant gathered them into cover behind a broken wall. This is it. 2 fire teams staggered, swift breach upper floors first. No mistakes. She checked her rifle, her gear. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind wandered. She remembered another school, another time. Not hostile, not fortified. Just quiet, abandoned except for the chalk still clinging faintly to the board. She walked through that place on patrol once years ago and wondered what it looked like filled with laughter instead of war. She wondered now if her son's classroom looked the same, if he sat in the back or the front, if he raised his hand with the same quiet determination she once had at his age. And she wondered if she would ever see it with her own eyes again. The lieutenant's voice snapped her back. "You ready?" She nodded once. The squad stacked at the breach. Boots shuffled, hands gripped tighter, breaths came faster. And then the silence before a storm. The door blew inward. Gunfire erupted. Shouts, screams, wood splintering, metal twisting. She moved with precision, her silence not shaken but sharpened. Her rifle cracked once, twice, bodies dropping where they stood. The squad surged forward, step by step, room by room. Collins took a round to his vest, the impact slamming him back into a wall. He gasped, wheezing, panic flaring in his eyes. She knelt beside him, pressing him down with a firm hand. Her eyes met his. Calm, steady, breathe. He did, shaking, but he did. And then she rose again, sweeping the hall. A door slammed shut ahead. Boots pounded behind it. She followed. The others held the line, covering, securing. But she kept moving, drawn like a string pulled taut. Down the hall, up the stairs, toward that voice. She knew what waited on the other side. She knew who. And yet she couldn't stop. Because this wasn't just the mission anymore. This was the past reaching out of the dark, demanding payment. She stopped outside the door, her rifle aimed, her breath steady. And then she heard him. Closer this time, just beyond the thin wood. "I warned you," he said. Her silence cracked. She whispered so soft only the walls could hear, "Not this time." And she pushed the door open. What did she expect to find when the door swung open? Gunfire, a blade rushing at her throat, the ghost of a man who should have died years ago. Instead, the room was empty. 4 cracked walls, a sagging table, a lantern burning low. The air smelled of sweat, gun oil, and something acrid, the kind of stench that clings to places where fear has lived too long. And yet his voice lingered. It was here, she thought. No, he was here. She stepped inside, rifle raised, silence heavy on her breath. The squad's noise downstairs seemed distant now, muffled by the pounding of her own heart. The door behind her clicked shut. She spun. He stood there, older than she remembered, his beard streaked with gray, scars carved deep into his cheek, like time itself had tried to erase him and failed. His eyes, sharp, dark, unblinking, were exactly the same. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he smiled. "I wondered," he said, his voice low, smooth, carried by memory as much as sound, "if it would be you they sent." Her rifle never wavered, but her hands tightened around it until her knuckles burned. It wasn't just an enemy standing in front of her. It was unfinished business. "You should have stayed dead," she whispered. His smile widened. "Ah, so you do remember." The weight of years pressed down. She remembered nights on rooftops, chasing whispers of him. She remembered bodies left behind, traps sprung too late. She remembered her commanding officer's blood staining her gloves because she'd been seconds too slow. And above all, she remembered the vow she'd made, standing over those graves. If I ever hear his voice again, I will end it. Now here he was, flesh and breath, no longer a ghost. But her silence cracked under the noise of memory. Her finger hovered over the trigger. Yet she didn't shoot. Because he wasn't holding a weapon. Not in his hands. Instead, he tilted his head toward the corner of the room. Her eyes followed. And there, bound to a chair, gagged, bruised, was the hostage. Alive. Barely. Her rifle faltered an inch. He saw it. He saw the hesitation. And his smile turned cruel. "You've grown colder," he said softly, "but not enough. Still the same weakness in your eyes." The hostage moaned faintly, thrashing against ropes. Her mind split in two. One half screamed, "Take the shot, end him now." The other half begged, "If you miss, if he moves, the hostage dies." Her silence was no longer steady. It was a storm held behind clenched teeth. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, his hands still empty. "I learned something about you," he said. "Back then, in that other war, I learned you hesitate. You carry your ghosts with you. You wear them like armor, but they drag you down." He stopped just out of reach, his eyes boring into hers. "And I learned that silence of yours," he chuckled. "It's not strength, it's guilt." The words sliced deeper than any blade. Her chest burned, memories colliding her son's face, the boy in the rubble, the men she lost. Maybe he was right. Maybe her silence was guilt. But it was also the reason she was still standing. The reason the men downstairs followed her steps. The reason Collins was still alive. Her silence had steadied every march, every shot, every moment she couldn't afford to break. And now it steadied her again. Her breath slowed, her rifle lifted back into place. "Maybe," she said softly, "but guilt is heavier when it's still breathing." His smile faded. For the first time, his eyes flickered. A shadow of doubt. And in that crack, she saw her opening. The hostage's chair creaked, his head lolled, time was bleeding out. The decision carved itself sharp in her chest. She couldn't kill the ghost without risking the life tied to that chair. And she couldn't free the hostage without letting the ghost slip away again. One choice meant closure, the other meant duty. Her silence pressed in. Her son's laugh echoed faintly in memory. The promise she made to him, "I'll come back." She lowered the rifle a fraction, not surrendering, choosing. "Get the hostage," she called through the radio, her voice steady for the first time. Boots thundered on the stairs. The squad surged into the room, weapons raised, eyes wide. The ghost stepped back into shadow, slipping between them like smoke. A burst of fire cracked from the hall, soldiers shouting, chasing, but she didn't follow. She knelt by the hostage, cutting the ropes, lifting his broken body against her shoulder. His breath rattled, shallow but alive. The lieutenant's voice snarled in her ear. "He's escaping, we can take him." She closed her eyes. And for the first time, she spoke more than a whisper. "No," she said, "we've got what we came for." The room stilled. The squad looked at her, confusion flashing in their eyes. But none of them argued. Because her silence had always steadied them. And now, her voice carried more weight than any bullet. She carried the hostage out into the fading light, her boots striking dirt in rhythm again. Behind her, Gunfire faded into the distance. The ghost was gone. But not forever. Because this time she hadn't lost him to failure. She had let him go. And that meant she could find him again. The march back began. Dust rose once more around their boots. The men muttered, coughed, caught their breath. She said nothing. But now her silence wasn't guilt. It was patience. The war wasn't over. Why did she pause at the doorway, hand resting on the chipped wood as if it weighed more than steel? The others had gone inside already. Laughter spilled faintly from the hall beyond, forced and fragile. She stood there, silent, her eyes tracing the grain of the door as if it might hold the answer she had been avoiding for days. The march had ended hours ago, but the real weight followed them home. They weren't on the battlefield tonight, at least not in the literal sense, but the ghosts walked in with them. Inside, the men and women of her unit tried to shake it off. Boots clattered against the floor. Someone turned on an old speaker that buzzed faintly with music, the kind that once reminded them of ordinary days but now felt like an insult to their bones. She knew what this was: survival in disguise. Soldiers laughed not because anything was funny, but because silence was unbearable. She finally stepped in, slow, like wading into cold water. The faces that turned toward her did so with a flicker of recognition, not because she was the highest in rank, not because she barked orders, but because her quiet had become the thread they clung to without realizing it. A younger soldier, barely 22, tried to catch her eye. He had blood on his sleeve, still someone else. He was wiping it off like dirt, as if that would erase the memory. His voice cracked when he asked, "Ma'am, you good?" She didn't answer. She only nodded once, slow, deliberate. It was enough to let him unclench his jaw and exhale. But she wasn't good, not even close. At the far end of the room, Sergeant Blake was recounting something that happened during the march, something about a goat in the hills and the absurdity of the moment. The others laughed, some even slapped the table. She almost smiled. Almost. But the memory beneath it was darker. She remembered the ridge beyond that goat, the glint of glass in the sun, the impossible stillness that preceded the ambush. She hadn't told them, not yet. She sat near the wall, her back straight, hands resting on her knees. No drink in her hand, no words on her lips. She simply listened. Her silence wasn't empty. It was presence. It told them someone was still holding the line even in this dim room with its broken lights and smell of gun oil. That if their laughter cracked, if their masks slipped, she'd still be there, unmoved. But in her chest, the storm hadn't settled. She could still hear the thud of her heartbeat that morning when the column had moved through the valley. The dust clung to their throats. The sun burned without mercy. And in the rhythm of each step she carried something none of them had seen, none of them knew. A folded letter tucked deep in her pack, written in a hand she hadn't touched in years. She hadn't opened it yet, not since it was delivered. Her eyes drifted to the younger soldier again. His laugh was forced now, teeth clenched too tight. She could tell he hadn't slept in days. She could tell he wanted to ask her more, to lean into her silence and let it absorb his panic. But he didn't. He was afraid of what he might hear back. And she was afraid of what she might say if she let her voice break open. So she said nothing. Later that night, when the hall emptied and the lights dimmed, she walked outside. The desert air pressed cool against her skin. The stars stretched wide and merciless, cold witnesses to human struggle. Her boots crunched against the gravel. Every sound seemed too sharp in the quiet. That's when Blake followed her out, shoulders heavy, cigarette already lit. He offered her one without words. She shook her head. "You scare the hell out of them, you know that," he said finally, smoke curling upward like a fragile prayer. She raised an eyebrow but didn't reply. "Not in a bad way," he went on, his voice rough, softened by weariness. "They watch you, every step, every damn thing you don't say. It's like they lean on it." She looked past him at the horizon where darkness met darker mountains. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she wasn't their anchor, that she was breaking just as quietly as the rest of them. But the words stuck. Instead, she asked softly, "And you?" Blake smirked, bitter. "Me, I'm too old to lean on anyone." He flicked ash into the gravel. "But I'll tell you something. I've seen men break louder than gunfire. I've seen women beg the sky to take them. But your silence, it's steadier than a sermon." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. In her chest, though, the letter burned like a coal. Its weight pressed harder than any rucksack, heavier than the rifle she cleaned each night. She hadn't opened it because she already knew. The handwriting had been enough. The name on the envelope. Her sister. and her sister was gone. The stars blurred for a moment, just enough that she blinked it away. She clenched her jaw, breath deep, and turned back toward the dim hall where her unit slept restlessly. They didn't know, not yet. But soon, the mission would force the truth out of her. And when it did, silence might not be enough. Why did the alarm cut through the night like that, shrill, urgent, slicing through the thin veil of restless dreams? She jolted upright, boots half-laced at the side of her cot, heart already racing before her mind caught up. The others scrambled too, voices low but sharp, gear clattering in the dark. It wasn't gunfire, not yet, but the tone of that alarm told her everything. Movement on the perimeter, something stirring in the shadows. She swung her rifle across her chest, the weight settling against her like an old truth. Outside, the night air was colder than before, stars still burning in their pitiless quiet. The valley lay stretched out, black and infinite, the mountains framing it like the jaws of a trap. Her silence followed her even here. Others barked orders, checked positions, muttered prayers under their breath. She only moved, deliberate, each step a choice. The younger soldier from earlier, the one with blood on his sleeve, caught up beside her. His face was pale in the starlight. He whispered, "You think it's them." She didn't answer, but in the sharpness of her glance he read enough. Yes. She scanned the horizon, searching for the glint, the flicker, the shadow. Nothing yet. Only the hum of fear threading through the unit. Blake came up behind her. Scouts say movement in the ravine. Could be nothing, could be worse. His voice carried that half-swallowed tension, the one every seasoned soldier knew, hope trying to fight with dread. She nodded once, no hesitation. She started walking toward the outpost edge, the others falling into motion around her as if drawn by gravity. They didn't question, they didn't wait. The silence between their boots and the gravel was louder than any speech. Then from the ridge a crack, a sound too sharp, too precise, not a branch, not a stone, a shot. The first scream followed seconds later. Chaos ripped the night apart. Muzzle flashes stuttered like broken lightning. Shouts echoed, scrambled, cut short. Dust and gunpowder bit at her tongue. She dropped low, rifle up, eyes narrowing against the flare and dark. Beside her the young soldier froze. His breath came ragged, shallow, chest heaving as if he'd forgotten how to breathe. She didn't look at him fully, just pressed her hand against his shoulder, firm, grounding. A silent order, a silent promise. He inhaled deep, his rifle rose. They pushed forward step by step into the shadows of the ravine. The air reeked of metal and fear. Every heartbeat felt borrowed. She remembered then another night, another ambush, another silence. The memory cut so deep it made her pause, if only for a breath. Her sister's voice, not from the letter but from the last time they spoke, flickered through her like an ember. You don't always have to carry it alone. But she did. She pressed on, her boots crunching against stone, her body moving as if the weight inside her didn't exist. Gunfire raked the rocks. Blake swore under his breath, returning fire, his voice hoarse from shouting. The younger soldier stumbled but caught himself. A medic dragged someone bleeding toward cover. Every detail burned into her senses. The hot brass on her skin, the smell of dirt torn by bullets, the way the stars above didn't move, didn't care. And through it all her silence remained. When the fight finally broke, when the last echo faded into the night and the valley exhaled its bitter smoke, they counted the wounded, the missing, the gone. The younger soldier sat with his back against a stone, trembling, alive but hollow-eyed. He looked at her then, as if trying to understand what kept her steady when everything else cracked. She didn't speak, she only looked back. Because the truth was she wasn't steady, not inside. She was breaking, quietly, invisibly, but her silence was the only gift she could still give them. The letter in her pack seemed to burn hotter now, as if it too had survived the firefight, as if it were demanding to be read. She didn't, not yet. Blake limped over, his sleeve torn, blood darkening the cloth. "We held," he rasped, exhaustion dragging at his voice. "Barely, but we held." He studied her for a long moment, then softer. "You ever gonna tell us what you're carrying?" Her jaw tightened, she said nothing. And in that silence, he sighed, like a man who already knew he wouldn't get an answer. But she knew, sooner or later, silence wouldn't protect her anymore. Sooner or later, it would break. Why did her hands shake when no one was watching? She held them still now, pressed flat against her thighs as if pinning the tremor into silence. Around her, the others tried to rest, bodies draped against rocks, helmets tilted back, eyes half closed but never fully surrendered to sleep. The ambush had left them raw. Every sound in the valley now carried suspicion, every shift of gravel, every sigh of wind. She sat apart, back against a cold boulder, rifle within reach. The stars hung mercilessly clear above them. For the first time in years, she wished for clouds, something to hide under, something to soften the sharpness of everything. The letter was still in her pack. Its edges had frayed against the fabric, as if it too had endured the march, the dust, the blood. She had carried it across borders, through firefights, across miles of desert heat. She hadn't opened it, not because she couldn't, but because once she did, the silence would shatter, and she wasn't sure she could rebuild it. The young soldier approached, careful in his steps as though she might startle. He lowered himself beside her, knees bent, arms resting on them. For a moment he said nothing. She could feel the words pressing against his lips, struggling to be born. Finally he whispered, "How do you do it?" She turned her head slow, meeting his wide, searching eyes. He looked like a boy who had seen too much too soon. "Stay calm," he clarified, almost embarrassed. "When it's chaos, when people are screaming, when—" his voice faltered, he swallowed hard. "When I freeze." Her silence was heavy, but it wasn't cruel. She let it sit between them until the night air filled it. Then, without speaking, she unclipped her canteen and handed it to him. He drank, his hands trembling, and when he passed it back, he managed a small nod. Somehow that was enough. But inside she remembered her own freeze the first time. The night her sister was lost, the radio static, the order that came too late, the silence that followed. She had frozen then for seconds that felt like hours, and she had carried that weight ever since, hidden beneath her quiet. She thought of telling him, of letting him know that calm didn't mean untouched. That silence wasn't the absence of fear, it was the mask of it, but her throat locked as it always did. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder, steady, wordless, and his shoulders eased if only a fraction. Blake approached later, his limp more pronounced now. He crouched near them, his voice low, gruff. "Command sending us further up the valley. Dawn march. They want us to clear the ridge." His eyes flicked to her, reading her the way only he could. "You up for it?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at the stars, the jagged line of mountains, the boy beside her who was pretending to sleep but whose breath still trembled. Then she nodded. Blake studied her a moment longer. "You ever gonna break that silence of yours?" he asked quietly. Her gaze dropped to the ground. The gravel shimmered faintly in the starlight. "Finally," she said, so softly it was almost lost to the wind, "not yet." Blake's brow furrowed. He wanted to push. He didn't. He rose with a grunt, muttering something about old bones, and walked back to the others. She closed her eyes for a moment. The memory of her sister's laugh, sharp, sudden, alive, cut through her like a blade. She reached for her pack, fingers brushing the letter, but she stopped. She couldn't. Not tonight. The dawn came too soon. A pale light spilled over the valley, painting the rocks in shades of gray and gold. They marched again, boots crunching in rhythm, the silence between them thick but united. Her steps set the pace. The boy followed close, Blake a steady shadow, the rest strung out behind like beads on a fraying cord. Every step forward pulled them deeper into uncertainty. The ridge loomed ahead, steep and unforgiving. Somewhere beyond it, an enemy waited. And somewhere within her, A truth waited too. She tightened the strap of her pack, the letter pressed against her back like a heartbeat. She said nothing, but every soldier's step aligned with hers. And as the sun rose higher, painting their faces in light and dust, they didn't even realize it was her silence, her burden, that was holding them together. Not yet. Why did the valley seem so still, as if the earth itself was waiting to see what they would do? The march had led them here, up the jagged slope through the dust, into the shadow of the ridge where danger waited in silence. The air was thin, sharp in their lungs. Every step felt like a question. Every glance at her was a plea. The boy stumbled once, caught himself. Blake muttered curses under his breath, his limp dragging but his will unbroken. The others trudged on, eyes scanning, hearts pounding. No one spoke. She led them, quiet, steady. Her boots struck stone with unshaken rhythm. At the crest she lifted her fist. The column froze, the world hushed. Below in the shallow basin shadows moved, enemy figures, rifles slung, too many. A trap. Blake whispered, "We can't take that head on." The boy swallowed, panic flaring in his eyes. "Then what do we?" She raised a hand, silenced him. Her gaze swept the basin, tracing the ridges, the choke points, the way the sun was rising at their backs. Her mind ran the map without words. And then for the first time in days her lips parted. Her voice, low, steady, stripped of hesitation, slid into the morning air. "We set the line here." The others stiffened, surprised. Some even blinked as if they weren't sure they'd really heard her. But then the clarity of her tone cut through their doubt. She pointed, "Two on the rocks. Blake, cover the flank, hold fire until I move." The silence had broken, but it wasn't a flood, it was a blade, precise, controlled. The soldiers moved without question. The boy found his place, hand steadier now, breath syncing with hers. The enemy advanced, unaware of the eyes above. The seconds stretched thin. Sweat stung her brow. Her hand rested on the stock of her rifle, finger still. And then, with the weight of everything, her sister's voice, the folded letter in her pack, the faces of the people who trusted her silence, she gave the only command that mattered. "Now!" Gunfire cracked. The ridge erupted. Echoes tore across the valley, rolling like thunder. Dust and shouts and sparks of metal filled the air. The enemy scrambled, stumbled, broke against the line they hadn't seen. Her shots were measured, unhurried. Each one found its mark, not rage, not vengeance, precision. The boy held his ground. Blake roared with each squeeze of his trigger. The unit fought not like scattered soldiers, but like a single body, each movement flowing from the rhythm she had set. Minutes bled into eternity. Then slowly the noise thinned. The last shouts faded. The valley exhaled smoke and silence once more. They held. Bodies shifted. Wounded were tended. Weapons reloaded with trembling hands. The boy sat hard against the stone, breath ragged, tears streaking dust on his face, but alive. Blake leaned on his rifle like a cane, sweat soaking his collar, eyes sharp with weary pride. And she stood at the crest, staring at the basin below. Her silence returned. Not the brittle kind, not the desperate kind, but the kind forged in fire. The kind that didn't need to explain itself anymore. Blake limped up beside her. He followed her gaze. Then he asked, quiet, "What was it? What's been holding you under all this time?" For a moment she didn't answer. Then slow she unstrapped her pack, pulled free the folded letter. The edges were worn, the paper soft from sweat and time. She didn't open it, she didn't need to. "My sister," she said, her voice low but clear. "She never came back." Blake's jaw worked. He nodded once, heavy with understanding. The boy watched from a distance, his breath catching. For him it was revelation. For her it was release. She tucked the letter back. No tears, no collapse, just the quiet acceptance that silence had been both her prison and her shield. The march resumed hours later. They moved slower now, the weight of what had passed etched into every step. But something was different. Her silence no longer pressed them down, it carried them. Each soldier walked in rhythm with her. Their boots struck the ground with steadiness, as if her silence had become the cadence of their survival. And when dusk fell, when the horizon swallowed the sun and left only shadow, no one asked her to speak again. They didn't need her words. They had her silence. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.